Thank you very much, Theo, and thank you for having me here as a speaker. One of the beneficial effects of the pandemic for me is that I was able to attend many more interesting events than I used to be able to, especially this is a very busy time of the year in which I will probably not be able to attend in person, but it's much easier. And also another beneficial effect was the time to reflect on new issues, more broader issues, such as the evolving relationship between sciences and the humanities, the issues we are discussing here. My proposal today is to revisit some of the origins of this discussion. As it were, it's prehistory, let's say, and I'm going to show some slides, which I hope you see. So the purpose of this talk is to invite reflection concerning the benefits of alternative historiographic frameworks when dealing with questions relating to how to read, interpret, and contextualize early modern texts. It is the result of some years of reflecting on a difficult question. As some of you might know, I have been working rather a long time on Francis Bacon's methodology of experimentation. And one of the difficulties I have always encountered with that is that of context. What is the right context of Bacon's project for a reformation of learning? Is there such a thing as the right context? Or would one rather benefit from reading these texts in very different contexts? I have tried during the past couple of years to read some of these texts in a context such as the early modern medicine of the mind, treatises on passions and Stoic pedagogy, the context of travel and exploration, the context of Renaissance cosmographies and the evolving genre of cosmographical natural history, the context of natural magic, the context of recipes and the evolving genre of the recipe, and the context of fables and emblems. And I found all these contexts extremely useful. By reading, for example, the first part of Bacon's New Organon against the background of a whole range of theories dealing with the question how to discipline, treat, and mend the diseased mind, namely what I call the context of the medicine of the mind, one can spot all sorts of interesting things that have usually escaped the attention of those reading the first part of the Novum Organum as an early modern epistemology avant la lettre. Similarly, by looking at Bacon's natural histories in the context of early modern or Renaissance cosmographies, one is struck by the structured and organized nature of Bacon's project, by its polemical nature, but also by its critical, active, and fruitful engagement with the existing natural history tradition. And so on, reading Bacon's New Atlantis in the context of travel and exploration, as many scholars have done recently, had led to a reconstruction of this text in a completely different manner than it used to be read once upon a time as one of the early modern utopias. So let me call perspectival contextualism a historiographic take, according to which, by placing texts in different intellectual contexts, one can spot details that have escaped so far the attention of the readers, such as interesting similarities between authors who are not usually read together, such as intersections or similarities between problems usually taken to belong to very different disciplines, or even to very different fields of knowledge, or such as common tools and devices used across fields. And today I would like to talk about such a device I called the emblem. Widely present in natural philosophical texts, emblems are striking images fabricated from words, images assembled from the characters and stories of the ancient fables. They refer to Pan, Ceres, Orpheus, Proteus, and Prometheus, and attribute all sorts of natural philosophical significations to these Olympian masks. Pan, or the nature or the universe. Ceres, the depiction of all arts and sciences. Proteus, the multi-faced and protean matter, or Prometheus, providence, are just several of such associations one can find, for example, in the works of Francis Bacon. And here you have the Sapientia Veterum a work to which I will return later. One thing these emblems have in common is that they are pictures made of words. Even if now and then we can find an engraving of them in a book or another, the engraved image is secondary to the verbal construction. Another thing these emblems have in common is that they fulfill a wide range of epistemic function. They are used for teaching. They are powerful mnemonic devices. Sometimes they fulfill important roles in the rhetorical construction of the argumentation. Last but not least, they were used in natural philosophy. Some, like Francis Bacon, not only used emblems, but developed a theory of the emblems in this little book. Others, like Newton, used them to construct a whole philosophy of history. We find such emblems with their whole cohort of classical references in the work of the first generation of Newtonians, for example, at the beginning of the 18th century. In one of the first textbooks of Newtonian philosophy, David Gregory's Elements of Physical and Geometrical Astronomy, we can find references to the ancient who constructed such emblems to communicate, but also to disguise the more sophisticated and esoteric part of their philosophy. And here is a quote referring to the ancients who feigned Apollo playing upon a harp of seven strings, by which symbol, as it is abundantly evident from Pliny, Macrobius, and so on, they meant the sun in conjunction with the 7 planets, for they made him the leader of that septenary chorus and the moderator of nature. Why did early modern philosophers use such a vivid imagery to talk about discovery? Why did they appeal to the language of the ancient fables in their natural philosophical explanations? For a long time, these images I call emblems were rather embarrassing for the historian of science. Some dismissed them as mere allegories, others saw in them the persistence of the obsolete so-called emblematic worldview. They were treated as additions, classical scholia, to modern texts, reminiscences of a humanist technique of reading and writing carried over the threshold of the scientific revolution. All in all, they were seen as traces of the past, imported in the new science. Additions one can dismiss because they relate merely to the form and not to the content of a text. Some of you might be familiar with the debate that took place at the end of the last century around the provocative article Newton and the Pipes of Pan, in which Maguire and Rattansi attempted to relate Newton's use of these images and fables and emblems to his beliefs in a pia or prisca philosophiae. Cassini replied with a seminal article that showed Newton at work as a humanist, employing humanist techniques in the construction of his texts. But the debate somehow didn't go further, or not far enough. Of course, Bacon and Newton were trained as humanists and used the techniques and language, or rather the languages, of the Studia Humanitatis when building their new theories, when inventing the new sciences. But how did they do it? And what was the import of this cross-fertilization between the humanist techniques and humanist languages and the new scientific theories? Or with the terms we are using today, between humanities and the early modern sciences. Must have lost a slide somewhere. Did I? No, I didn't. But I only wanted the title. Let me just return here for the moment. So this is the general question behind my talk. What is the epistemic import of the use of this language of the fables? What kind of role did emblems play in the early modern science? And here is my answer. Emblems first play a traditional mnemonic role, a use that all fables had. They were used in teaching and memorizing things, and in a way in which is familiar to those who are teaching sciences today. We always use mnemonic devices, little tricks to impart into the minds of our students some contents we want them to remember. Second, they had a heuristic role. They could function as set problems one has to look into, inquire further, think about. They encoded questions. And last but not least, sometimes also some of the emblems play a supplementary role. They were the elements from which one could construct a modern mythology, a mythology of the sciences. To argue for my claims, I will proceed as follows. I will give first a working definition of what I think emblems are and of the context in which this discussion was made. And then I will give you an example. I will show how Bacon assembled such emblems, theorizing their mnemonic and heuristic issues. And there will be a bit of a Newton at the end as well. I keep going ahead with my slides, apologies. So by way of a tentative definition, I say that I take emblems to mean strikingly visual verbal descriptions of characters or stories borrowed from the arsenal of classical fables and employed in the context of teaching, learning, and discovery. It is very important that emblems are constructed with words. Unlike the more traditional books of emblems, very famous in the Renaissance, or in some of the Renaissance reference books called mythographies, of which I will talk in a moment more, where images are amply illustrated by engravings, in the text of the early moderns, the visual depiction does not exist. Or if it does, it is secondary to the text, is a mere illustration. What we have are these visual, very visual depictions of fables, but written in writing, in words. And here are some examples. These are from Newton. So Newton, in the famous classical Scholia, of which more later, refers to the same gods of the ancients and attributes to the ancients the discovery of things such as atoms and vacuum, or the harmony of the world. The ancient philosophers attributed gravity to atoms without telling us the means, unless in figures. So speaking figuratively, they called God harmony, representing him and the matter of the universe, by the god Pan and his pipe, or by calling the sun in the prison of Jupiter, because he keeps the planets in their orbs. This is a draft fragment intended to be included in the first edition of the Optics, 1704. But it's not an exceptional example. The second is another example, this time from a draft intended for the second edition of the Principia. Pythagoras, Newton says, believed that the sun and the planets to be gods, and said that the sun, because of its powerful force of attraction, is in Jupiter's jail. That is a body endowed with the greatest possible divine force with which the planets are locked inside their shells. For the mystic philosophers, Pan was the highest divine creature who inflamed this world and melodically played it like a musical instrument with a harmonic ratio. Therefore, they called both God and harmony the souls of the world, composed by harmonic numbers. These fragments have fascinated many scholars and triggered debates. I'm not going to enter in these debates. I only want to reflect upon how are these images constructed, from what bits and pieces. Mark that Newton takes the well-known image of God Pan from the ancient mythology, an image that would be familiar to most of his readers, both in terms of its words and in terms of its visual content, and posit it as a representation of matter, namely the stuff of the universe. Or in the second quote, a representation of the laws of nature or the harmony of the universe. In doing these attributions, he exploits the codes of a language well known by his contemporaries, the language of the fables. Fabula was the Latin rendering of the Greek word mythos, and was used rather indiscriminately through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance to refer to Greek mythology, the works of Roman poets, most notably Ovid and Virgil, and to the more poetic passages of philosophical works. What we would call today Plato's myths were also fables. A fable is a story with a hidden meaning, a riddle one has to crack. And ever since the late antiquity, we find it at the center of a particular way of reading and writing I call the language of the fables. The main characteristic of this way of reading is that it regards texts as collections of fables. For the Renaissance readers, the Orphic hymns, Plato's Republic, or Ovid's Metamorphoses had this in common, namely that they were collections of fables, and thus they were often read using similar lenses. The reader was supposed to identify the story present in the text, the fable, disentangle its elements, characters, episodes, and then search for the hidden meaning encoded in them. To facilitate interpretations, writers provided from very early on explicit collections of fables, which provided the reader with materials to substantiate this way of reading. And sometimes these collections came together with a theory of interpretations. The resulting compilations are usually called mythographies, and you have here a title page of one of the most famous such collections, of which more in a moment. The genre of mythography was already established in the Middle Ages, but its golden age was the Renaissance. The early moderns followed on the footsteps of the Renaissance mythographers, although in some interpretations, what happened in the early modern Europe can be characterized as an end of this emblematic world picture. The language of the fables was more persistent than that, often surviving, as we have already seen, the changes of the worldview characteristics of the scientific revolution. So what we see in the quotes from Newton is that, like many of his contemporaries, he uses the language of the fables, making use to references well known to all his contemporaries, references we call today, although some were called in their own days, mythographies. And both the association of Pan with the universe or matter and the identification of Pan with Jupiter are well-known elements widespread in these mythographies. For example, they can be found in this book by Natalis Contis that Newton had in his library. In the Renaissance, large-scale compilations such as this provided popular source books for all sorts of enterprises. And they were for a long time treated as a sort of block. And it is only more recently that scholarly attention was devoted to some of these popular source books. They made a very interesting reading, which I can testify since I did a bit of this myself recently. And one can perhaps classify them, and I'm trying to classify them in 3 different genres. Some mythographies, such as the popular Giraldi History of the Gods from 1548, follows earlier mythographies in focusing on etymologies. They are interested in names of gods and a potential meaning of these names, such as the etymology of Pan, the etymology of the word Pan, which stands to the whole of the universe. A second category of mythographies are those who focus on the images or statues of gods. A popular example of this is Cartari, the Images of Ancient Gods, another book that Newton had in his library, 1580, but with many editions afterwards. Cartari's book is very close to fabricating emblems. His depiction of fables centers on the features and offices of each god, Saturn, Jupiter, Diana. However, Cartari's images of gods are not what I call emblems because they are extremely polysemic. He exploits the multiple meanings and often plays with double or triple aspects of God. His Jupiter is also Pan, exploiting the Orphic interpretation, which associates Jupiter with Pan and with nature. When Cartari book is illustrated, and it does not happen from the very beginning, engravings are added to it only after it becomes a bestseller and is translated in different languages. But when the book is illustrated, the engraver does depict this double aspect of the images of gods. And here is the depiction of Jupiter. And so Cartari's pen is constructed from bits and pieces coming from Greek mythology, and it's put in kind of the same chapter as Jupiter, as being a phase of Jupiter or face of Jupiter, what this image is showing us. When the text of Cartari also exploits such conflicting interpretations, while also adding to his images many features, as many as one can get from the ancient sources. So Cartari's pen is constructed from bits and pieces coming from Greek mythology, Orphic hymns, Plato's Cratylus, and previous mythographies. What we get is a sort of dictionary entry which contains all the meanings, features, conflicting interpretations that were ever ascribed to pen. A third category of mythographies is that more philosophically inclined, one exploiting the topic that will become so central to Bacon, for example, that of the ancient wisdom that these images of gods do contain. And a good example of this is Natalis Conti, who wrote perhaps the most popular of the 16th century mythographies, the immensely popular Mythologiae, first edition 1548, many editions until the very end of the 17th century. Conti's books differs from others because his images focus on the story and not on the character or on the name of a god. He clearly sees fables as stories with hidden meaning, and the meaning is philosophical. He claims that the ancients, for example, here's the quote, the ancients did not openly teach the principles of philosophy. Instead, they found a secret mythological disguise for disseminating these truths. And so on. You can see, I'm not reading the whole paragraph. We might call this the hieroglyphic meaning of fables. It claims that ancient wise men willingly disguised truth under the form of the fables in order to conceal it from the eyes of the vulgar. Philosophy was thus handed down in this disguised form until the present day, but we need a key for interpreting it. Although Cartari and Conti agreed on the fact that fables and the images of God encapsulate this hidden meaning, they have different explanations of this fact. Cartari is more inclined to what we might call an accommodationist theory. For him, the statues of gods have a clear pedagogical purpose. If they are mysterious, this is to raise curiosity and entice further exploration. They were created this way to facilitate the access to more difficult matters, to help memorize and question, and perhaps also to go beyond appearances. They were used in this way by the ancients, but they can also be used in this way by the moderns. This is how another mythographer, Cesare Ripa, summarizes the accommodationist interpretation. And that's accommodationist is my term, but it's from a different century, but bear with me. So the images of gods are nothing else but veils and garments fabricated in order to recover that part of philosophy regarding the generation and corruption of natural things, the disposition of the heavens, the influences of the star, the stability of the earth, and so on. There is a mystery behind it. The purpose for disguising the mystery is to teach, and to teach in familiar terms. In this way, it's almost like the accommodationist theory of religion. This interpretative discussion opens the way to a modern genre of doing philosophy according to the fables, and we can see in the works of Francis Bacon, and we shall see in a minute. But it also allows a more restricted interpretation of an image of God or a particular episode of a fable, reducing the multiplicity so characteristic to Renaissance mythographers to something more similar to what I call an emblem. But there is also, I think, a third way of reading the claim that fables encapsulate ancient wisdom. And this is also relevant when we talk about the transformation of the humanist learning into modern science. This is what we might call the poetic or the oracular or insightful reading. Its premise is that there once existed a primary, perhaps revealed form of knowledge, which got corrupted, perhaps because of the fall, but which can be partially retrieved by an insightful reading. Some take this lost knowledge to be the Adamic theology, others the Prisca Sapientia, some attribute it to the ancient oracles, others to the divine revelations received by Moses. The common element behind this diversity is the belief that in the existence of some scattered seeds of knowledge, remnants of some sort of divine light, and to the possibilities of the poetical language to kindle and inflame these seeds. This interpretive stance allows us to read poetical texts as privileged depositories of truth simply because their authors had a more discerning eye than philosophers. Just a moment. We can find this interpretation behind what has been called the doctrine of the poetic nature of the scriptures. But we can find it in works of the early moderns as well. And to illustrate this, it's a passage from George Sandys, the introduction of his translation and interpretation and commentary on Ovid, called Ovid Metamorphosis, English, mythologized and represented in figures, where he says that the fables are more ancient than any extant authors and perhaps than letters themselves, and they can produce, here is the important thing, they can produce a deeper impression upon the mind than can be made by the liveless precepts of philosophy. So poetry is a more direct literature, okay, let's talk in modern terms. Literature is a more direct vehicle of communicating knowledge than philosophy or science can ever be. For the poet, not only renders things as they are, says Sandys, but what they are not, as if they were, or rather as they should be, agreeable to the high affections of the soul and more conducive to the magnanimity, juster than either man of fortune or the exalting virtue and suppressing of wise. For apparent it is that they among the heathen preserve that truth of the importance of the soul, and therefore Epicurus, who maintain the contrary, deported his scholars from the reading of poetry. So philosophers and poets are seen here in conflict. This is an old theory, and Sands is just one of the people who are kind of embracing this poetic reading. So just to summarize, we have these three interpretations and readings: the hieroglyphic reading, the accommodationist reading, and the poetic reading. Which of these was picked by the moderns? The case of Francis Bacon is a good example of how the old language of the fable can be put to work in an entirely new context in service of his new philosophy. In a series of writings, Bacon attempted to supplement, let me just also get to this, teaching and learning with the philosophy according to the parables that would integrate and domesticate the language of the fables, using it to create powerful emblems with mnemonic and heuristic functions. In his enormously popular book, De Sapientia Veterum, Bacon put to work what has been called an enormous amount of learning taken from ancient and modern historiographers to teach, in fact, elements of his own philosophy. He selected from the many interpretations of the fables a handful that would fit together and constitute a coherent emblem. Let us have a look at such an example. The fable of Pan plays a prominent role in this book as well. It's worth looking at how it is assembled. First, one can easily spot in Bacon elements coming from the same mythographers. And actually contemporary readers of Bacon did already spot this and put this book in the same shelf with the mythographies. There is a whole tradition of Bacon, the mythographer, and this a book as mythography. And there is a whole discussion about how Bacon borrowed or didn't borrow from the previous mythographers. But, and I'm sorry I don't have here a picture to show you, one can have a look at this book in comparison with the other mythographies and see the huge differences. First, the difference in size. Renaissance mythographies are huge folio books running to thousands and thousands of pages. Bacon book is a small duodecimo of kind of 50 pages, perhaps all in all. Bacon's description of Pan is short, vivid, easy to remember, and as we might say, almost univocal. He opposes to the wide diversity of features and offices attributed to Pan by the mythographers, a Pan whose characteristics are limited. His biform figure is supposed to signify the conflicting nature of matter, the struggle of appetites and forces at work in nature. The hairy countenance of Pan is taken to mean the radiative nature of bodies, namely the universal property of each individual body to emit and receive rays. Thus, Bacon claims that the Pan, the body of nature, is most elegantly and truly represented as covered with hair in allusion to the rays which all objects emit. All bodies in Bacon's universe emit rays, and this is represented figuratively in the emblem of Pan. For rays are like the hairs or bristles of nature. And the last row, for Pan's hair is longest in the beard. The long beard of Pan is taken to represent the rays of celestial bodies which operate and penetrate from a greater distance than any other rays. Now, this vivid description clearly has a mnemonic function. Pan's long beard is meant to remind the reader simply that celestial radiation is stronger than any body-body radiation. The office of Pan is that of a hunter, and so on. Bacon's construction of an emblem of Pan is both selective and creative. From the multiplicity of features attributed to Pan by the mythographers, he selects just a few, and then we can see him constructing a sort of one-to-one attribution. The mythographers claim, for example, that Pan's horns stand for the correspondence between the sublunary and the celestial, the phases of the moon, the power of the sun, and many other, 3, 4, 5 things are put there as being represented by the horns. Bacon does not select any of these attributions. For him, the horns of Pan signify something precisely, namely that there is a connection between sublunary and superlunary world. Nature is everywhere the same, a basic principle of homogeneity of matter. In a similar way in which the hairy countenance is taken to mean a kind of radiative theory of matter. Thus, in creating the emblem of Pan, we can see Bacon displaying selectivity and creativity. Moreover, and this is perhaps even more important, to the traditional mnemonic and pedagogical functions, he adds a third, a heuristic function. Because his emblems are clearly constructed to raise curiosity and problematize some of the more abstract aspects of Bacon's thought. In De Augmentis Scientiarum, a book he designed not as a book of fables, but as part 1 of the Instauratio Magna, it's a book on the organization of arts and sciences, the fable of Pan is revisited with the purpose of illustrating this time the heuristic procedure he calls doing philosophy according to the fables. This, he claims, is a new discipline midway between philosophy and poetry, which regulates the poetic imagination and enlists the poetic imagination in the game of discovery. We can perhaps see Bacon employing here the third interpretation of the fables I mentioned before, the poetic interpretation. Or we can see him as breaking with the mythographic tradition and using emblems creatively for the purposes of producing new knowledge. So how is the heuristic going? We can see that in the construction of a particular emblem inspired by Pan, and this is the emblem of the hunt of Pan, with elements also selected from Conti and Cartari. Bacon refers to the story in which Pan, while hunting, discovers the hidden goddess Ceres. The latter, Ceres, claims Bacon, stands for all the arts and sciences, while the hunt of Pan is a shortcut, Bacon says, for one of his more technical terms, that of learned experience, experientia literata, educated experience, namely a sort of art of discovery. So what does the reader understand when given the emblems and saying the hunt of Pan or literate experience is so-and-so? Clearly, in this case, we have gone beyond mnemotechnics, even beyond pedagogy. The resulting explanation is not, the resulting emblem, the hunt of Pan, is not an explanation, properly speaking, since the two terms involved, namely the hunt of Pan and the experientia literata, the learned experience, are equally obscure to the reader. To say that the experientia literata is the hunt of Pan is not to say, as was often interpreted, that for Bacon, like for most of his contemporaries, knowledge is something like a hunt, what has been called the Venatio model. It is important to stress that what Bacon calls the hunt of Pan is not a regular hunt. Pan is not just a human hunter, he is the god of hunt. He signifies the universe. So the hunt of Pan means the universe hunting for the works. And the works are serious, namely the arts and sciences. So the hunt of Pan means that there is a tendency, an intentional tendency inside of the universe to pursue the discovery of arts. This is at least Bacon's way of constructing a fable, constructing an emblem. Fixing the meaning of the hunt of Pan in this way is much more similar to formulating a problem, an unsolved problem, a problem that we have to think about, we have to try to solve. What is at stake is not anymore the recovery of some given lost wisdom of the ancients, not even an attempt to understand veiled truths. What seems to be at stake is an attempt to teach the reader some elements of Baconian philosophy and set further problem to solve. To conclude, then, emblems are pictures painted with words, constructed from elements of ancient fables, which can be found in mythographies and other books of the Renaissance. Unlike the fables of the ancients, emblems are selective and often creative. They are reducing the multiplicity of the received meanings and create new functions and new uses for the language of the fables. And by way of finishing, I'm skipping this, I promise to come back to a Newtonian moment. Imagine how it would look like if in the second edition of the Principia, proposition 7 of book 3, one of the propositions that we call the law of universal attraction, will be followed by what Newton intended to add there, namely this paragraph. So, proposition: gravity exists in all body universally and is proportional to the quantity of matter in each. Scholium: that gravity does not arise through the force of any point toward which the heavy body tends from everywhere, but through the force of the entire matter in the sphere of the earth, which pulls all bodies itself. Plutarch teaches based on the views of earlier philosophers. Accordingly, it's an old view that gravity towards the entire earth originates from this gravity to its individual particles, just as the attractive force of an entire magnet is composed of the attractive forces of the individual particles of which the magnet consists. Therefore, Lucretius teaches that there is no center of the universe and no infinite place, but rather infinitely many worlds in infinite space, worlds similar to ours, and so on and so forth. There's a bit more Lucretius and there's a bit more Democritus. Or if the proposition 3, book 3, proposition 8 would contain what Newton intended to add there, the ratio which gravity decreases as the distance from the planet increases was not sufficiently explained by the ancients. They appear to have concealed this ratio using the harmony of the celestial spheres, whereby they portray the sun and the remaining 6 planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and so on, as Apollo with the 7-stringed lyre, and measured the intervals between the spheres through the tone intervals, and so on for a good number of pages, dealing with the various ways in which the ancients have first discovered the fundamental laws of the universe, then coached them in the language of the fable and behind emblems. In the end, Newton did not publish this classical scholia, and the Principia looks deceptively like a modern physical textbook. The reference to the god Pan and his pipe, the harmony of the universe, and the correspondences between the planetary trajectories and the strings of Apollo's lyre remain in manuscript. Today, scholars have ventured to offer a number of explications or explanations for this act of self-censorship. This is not the moment to enter into details. I would only like to point out that in order to formulate an answer, one needs to begin with the problem I attempted to formulate here. One would need to understand better the process of construction of emblems, the process to which the early moderns attributed to them new epistemic functions. I have only covered in this talk 2 of these functions, the mnemonic and heuristic function, alluding to the fact that pedagogy is included in both. Let me end here by saying that there is another function worth looking at, and that is the mythological functions emblems can play. Bacon did not only rewrite the fables of Pan and Prometheus, he also rewrote the fable of the Atlantis. And his new Atlantis is also a construction of an emblem, organized through the same process of attributions I have tried to describe so far. But the result is a more complex product, something that has, in addition to its mnemonic and heuristic functions, a mythological role to play. Because we are still used today to ascribe the new Atlantis a role in the mythology of modern science. And thank you, and sorry for being so long.